Alright guys, Scrappy again today. Hope you're all doing well and enjoying your day so far. Kenny has no doubt been a massively important acquisition to this OpTic Texas team this season, but it turns out that other options were on the table for Kenny during the off-season Rostermania period. New York Subliners are one of the teams that potentially could have had Kenny if the stories went a bit different, but they were committed to Sib as their option. Had they taken the plunge on Kenny earlier, could he have joined that team? Would Sib have been going to OpTic Texas instead? What would that mean for the two respective performances of those teams this season? Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. First of all, a bit of update on the challenger side. Yeez is actually deciding to take a bit of a break here until at least after this elite. We've seen this now for a couple of players in challenges, and I think for understandable reasons, because, you know, you're just playing a lot of COD all of the time. There is a lot of, you know, action down there in challenges, to be fair, but it's an absolute grind, as we know. They call it the pit for a reason, right? So many roster changes, so much chaos, even Vivid, phenomenal, in my opinion, still CDL caliber player. Of course, after getting dropped by the Minnesota Rocker, which has happened a fair few times over the last few years, Vivid going, you know, out of the league. I do think he'll probably get back in at some point. In hindsight, maybe Rocker shouldn't have dropped him in the first place. Same thing for, like, you know, Awakening. I think Awakening, you know, they did need to make a change there, Minnesota Rocker, but nonetheless, he's been down in the Challengers pit, grinding it out. Those guys, some of these players will get a chance going forwards. Yeez is one of them that may, but he's going to take a break for now. That, of course, means that with Yeez is stepping away, Prolute is going to replace him on his former team, and that means the Houston Spartans are looking for one, because they dropped Fire for Prolute, so now they've got Fire back. So, you know, Challengers is different gravy, obviously. So Yee steps away, Prolute goes in there, Fire is now back on the team that he just got dropped from a couple of days ago. So it's funny how quickly you have to mend some of these relationships, right? Because, you know, Fire got dropped, I imagine that he wasn't so happy about it. Now they're like, oh, please, baby, come back, and then he comes back. So we'll see how they do. I'm pretty sure Major 4 in Burbank, LA, whatever, is not going to have a Challengers event, because typically the events will be hosted Challengers alongside the regular stuff. They did something in Miami, which was better than nothing. Of course, they had a great one in Toronto and in Boston. Charlotte, or Carolina, were meant to host this event in Charlotte, but it's not happening, and there were rumours that, let's be real, if they even did host that event, they probably weren't going to be running a Challengers event alongside it as well. So it's basically the next thing for Challengers, apart from the online stuff, is the World Championship, right? The Challengers Championship, which is coming up alongside Champs come July, of course, in Dallas. Plenty else to discuss. I thought it was kind of cool to see from Holly. I know she's mentioned this several times over the last few years around Karma, right? Her husband, Damon Karma, who is now the coach of OpTic Texas, talking about him returning to competing. She used to talk about it an awful lot when he'd kind of retired, but wasn't yet a coach or anything, about him returning to, you know, compete again. Now, Karma in some ways still gets to compete in some sense, and I don't think that Karma's really going to return as a COD pro anytime, unfortunately, but nonetheless, I think what he's doing is actually still pretty damn good and still gets those, I'm sure, competitive juices flowing to some degree. There are 4 teams that are guaranteed to make it to the World Championship according to analysis. Those, of course, are your top 4 teams. These are their expected point standings. This I thought was very interesting that Doug Levy put together here. So pretty much looking at the current strength of those teams, then looking at who they play for the rest of the season, what is their expected point score over 10,000 simulations if you run the league from now to the end of the season, with the matches that all these teams will play, with their expected result against those matches, what's going to happen, how many points will be accrued. These are the expected points, average points, over all of those simulations. So New York, Toronto, OpTic and FaZe make it 100% of the time. The other teams, though, do not make it 100% of the time. Boston will make it 0.5% of the time. So 1 in every 200 simulations, they will make it, roughly. So it's possible, but it's not going to happen. So they're expected to get to 90 points. I guess they have some achievable games from now to the end of the season. They're currently at 50, so, you know, even if they get to 90, it's obviously going to be nowhere near enough. The real craziness, though, is around here, right? Because the Champs cutoff, Doug has it, is at 160, between Minnesota and Vegas. So, you know, they would be tied on 160, but based on head-to-head and results and stuff like this, it would actually be Vegas that make it on the average simulation. But of course, you know, it could really go either way here. Like, anything is obviously still possible, but it is wild to think that the 5th place team in this simulation is on 170, and the cutoff at 160 is 8th place, and Ravens would miss out. But Ravens, the issue for them is they have a pretty hard run, like, of their matches from now to the end of the season. They really, I think, needed to beat Seattle Surge back at Major 3. If they did, they'd have been in a pretty damn good spot. But on these runner simulations, they're expected to get to 155. Gorillas, by the way, they only have a 22% chance to make it because they're not looking that good in terms of points. I think they're at 110. Their head-to-head isn't good. Their map win-loss is terrible. And they're just not looking very good at the moment anyway. So, you know, Gorillas can make it. They're in the ballpark. But it's probably quite unlikely. So really, you're looking at, you know, 2 teams not making it out of these 6. That would be my prediction anyway now, that probably Gorillas and Boston won't. But it's all to play for apart from that. Looks like Miami potentially could. Thieves have the best chance, and even Seattle Surge at, you know, 70, 75%. So, you know, it's absolute madness, really. I don't think we've seen anything quite like this in the CDL so far. Another Doug Levy stat I thought was kind of cool. Scrappy has had more than 25% of his team's damage in almost 80% of games. So your expected damage is 25% out of the 4, and depending on your role, that's either going to happen or not. And to be fair, when you play with Insight and stuff, he's going to be a slower player. It's probably going to be true that this happens with a fair degree of frequency, but at the same time, the 80% figure for Scrappy here, 79%, the next highest is attached at like 66%, is pretty wild, right? So Kenny the other day was asking questions for a Q&A, and he went through with some very interesting responses, certainly in terms of the Rostermania saga that happens in this past off-season, right? We weren't sure what was going to happen to that Los Angeles Thieves team. The rumours were emerging that Octane was going to retire. It was known behind the scenes for some time. Eventually that, of course, ended up becoming official. Drazah left to FaZe. Envoy left to Ultra. Kenny was potentially going to stay. Was he going to go? It wasn't really clear what was actually going to be happening there, right? Because, you know, those guys in some ways wanted to stay on Thieves, but they didn't have the budget anymore to support those players as the world champions of the previous season. Lots of interest in those guys, and for good reason. Kenny ends up on OpTic, and, you know, the rest since then is history. What he's, you know, helped achieve with that roster. Kenny's still winning a championship in every full LAN season that has happened that he's competed in COD. That continues this year on OpTic after last weekend out in Toronto. The question is, though, could he have ended up elsewhere? Because of those 4 players that were on the Thieves team at the end of last season, Octane is gone. Kenny on OpTic, Drazah on FaZe, Envoy on Toronto. None of those guys ended up on the New York Subliners, the other top team, and of course the world champions of last year, where they could have potentially gone. Kenny actually talks about this and basically says that yes, Subliners was an option. He wasn't sure what he was going to do before the OpTic situation became available, because it looked like Drazah was probably going to go to OpTic, and as soon as that, you know, became somewhat less clear, Kenny then reached out and said, hey, like, do you want me instead? And then they got the deal done relatively swiftly afterwards. But that was a little bit into the Rostermania saga. If Subliners had moved faster, they could have potentially secured Kenny's services. But Kenny says no, they didn't actually want me. They were happy with their approach instead.
But he has, during the offseason, where was your head at before the OpTic offer? Staying on LAT, going somewhere else, retirement. I don't know where this narrative is coming from that I'm going to retire. I feel like I'm looked at as like I'm so old, but I swear I'm one of the younger players in the league. Like, I'm not even the oldest on our team. And I don't know if that's how I carry myself, what it is, what it ain't. But I promise you, there has not been a single thought in my mind of retiring. No time soon. Like, I don't know where it's coming from, but I'll say that's for a fact not happening. But yeah, during the off season, to be blunt, obviously I wanted to stay at LAT. That was my home for the longest time. So I was trying to do whatever to stay on the team because I didn't really think there was a spot anywhere for me. I knew about Boston being a possible like spot. Me and Slasher are talking a good bit and all season about teaming up together again. So yeah, Boston was definitely an area that I was kind of thinking of joining, but at the same time, I think even then I was going to choose LAT over them, depending on what we could have got done with LAT, because there's a lot of things outside of my contract that I wanted done with LAT to ensure that they were kind of where I wanted to be forever. But as soon as I seen the OpTic spot open up, I hit up Shotzzy. He said he was down, and it kind of went from there. So it was kind of like, it wasn't one of those things. I mean, I hit up a bunch of teams. I hit up New York. I don't think New York wanted me. They said that they already had what they wanted. So there's a lot of teams I hit up, and I think after last year, I don't really fault a lot of teams for thinking low of me, I guess. But I know deep down in my heart I'm a winner. I know that for a fact. I have the highest of gunny. I'm a self gas. I can gun. I'm I'm shooting with the best, but I think at the same time, like, I can win. I know how to win. I know what it takes to win, and I think a lot of teams unappreciate that. So for me, I'm just appreciative of where I am right now, and I appreciate OpTic for allowing me on the team. So I think it was a blessing in disguise for me to kind of take this next step, I guess, in my career. I was kind of just weighing my options on what I thought the best team was or what my best place was to win next year. And with these players, I mean, who would say no? You know what I mean? Especially in my situation where I was on the end of like having to rebuild a whole roster around myself, and that was kind of like stressful. So for me, everything aligned perfectly. Talked to Hector, and we got it done.
So fascinating to hear that Kenny basically reached out to New York and said, hey, like, you know, you're looking for someone in that flex role potentially to upgrade on Priestahh. And I'm sure Kenny was thinking, hey, they ain't going to change. I mean, they're just one chaps. But then it was becoming relatively clear that there was actually some weird, well, what they called contractual stuff for salaries and all this between them and Priestahh. And therefore, well, we couldn't come to an agreement, so he has to go type thing. And we talked about this, of course, at the time. Actually, Ben even commented on it now and said, should be clear now after the Kenny video response that Dante, as in Sib, was always the replacement for Priestahh, and the contract offer was just a ruse to make a roster change. So we talked about this at the time, and, you know, I wouldn't say I caught some flack for it because I feel like it was pretty obvious what was happening here, but it certainly was against the party line because, you know, Subliners was saying, oh, well, you know, Priestahh, we offered him this amount of money, like a reduced amount, and Priestahh wasn't happy with it, and therefore these contract talks have failed. It always felt to me and many in the community that that was just kind of like a reason they were giving to make a change and to pack a punch. And I think it was relatively clear after Rostermania when they were quite, you know, forthright, really, Subliners, that, you know, they thought they needed to pack a punch their team. That's what they tried to do, getting Sib for Priestahh in that role. And these whole, you know, contract talk stuff where, well, as Ben describes, bit of a ruse. But that was the story from Kenny, that he wanted to stay on Thieves. He had the prospect of building an entirely new team around him on the Thieves, but it didn't really seem like the best idea, and understandably so. So then he talked to Slasher about the Boston move because they were offering a big bag, right? Slasher ended up going there, of course. He could have had Kenny on the team, which would have been, I mean, imagine that, Slasher and Kenny with, like, you know, Snoopy +1. Would have been interesting. Maybe Slasher and Kenny as a duo could have got something out of Snoopy in terms of, you know, what Slasher on his own potentially couldn't. Once the OpTic offer was there, of course, that was going to be happening and the spot opened up. But, you know, if Subliners acted somewhat faster or maybe changed their minds, they could have got Kenny over Sib, quite possibly. And what would that have meant for these respective teams? Because, of course, this is the New York Subliners as it stands at the moment. They, of course, fourth the last event. They were third, you know, one event to go, fourth this event. They're not a terrible team by any means. They're just not good enough right now to actually win an event. And Sib individually has been no doubt underwhelming this year. He was much better at the major, I think in part because he was like inspired by all the storylines. Like there was talk about Sib, if he doesn't perform this event, is he going to get dropped? There was talk about Sib, is he going to get Lil Manned by 0-4 and he's going to have to chop his balls off or whatever it was. So, you know, that never happened, right? And Sib played really well in those respective series. But over the course of the stage, and especially compared to like last year, these are example of Sib's numbers last year, which weren't, again, great. I mean, the year before arguably he was even better, but he was still pretty good. I mean, look at the kills per 10, look at the damage per 10, high impact, slaying player, and understandably Subliners thought Sib is going to be a pure upgrade. But I think Kenny, this is one of the reasons why I think Kenny's just like super underrated as a player. Like, if you're Subliners and Kenny comes knocking on the door, you've got to think about it. I mean, surely. Maybe they were just, you know, stuck with the idea that, you know, Sib's going to be their man and they're going to replace Priestahh. But if Kenny comes knocking, I mean, he can slay as well as Sib, I think, if Kenny requires to, maybe even better. And he's just, you know, a more impactful player in the other aspects of the game. So, to me, surprising that Subliners, you know, turned down that option. And, of course, it's been perfect for OpTic. Now, maybe even if New York were interested, by the time the deal was potentially going to get done, the OpTic offer might have been there, and of course, Kenny would have gone there instead, but it would have made things rather fascinating had this actually gone through. But very much interested to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.